At 11:45 p.m. on October 19, 1942, in total darkness off Cape Esperance, Lieutenant Robert Lynch realized his weapons were useless. His torpedoes were set too deep, his machine guns couldn't penetrate steel, and 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges were moving straight toward him anyway. Lynch was 26 years old, on his 14th night patrol, with 0 confirmed kills, crouched behind the wheel of PT-48, watching 60 Japanese troops and ammunition cut silently through black water. Each barge carried a Type 92 heavy machine gun and steel armor thick enough to shrug off rifle fire. Lynch had 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each weighing over 2,000 pounds, with nearly 500 pounds of TNT, but the minimum running depth was 10 feet, and the barges only drew 5, meaning the torpedoes would pass cleanly underneath without touching them. By mid-October, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had already lost 6 boats in these waters, and 17 sailors were dead, all to the same pattern: detect the barges, attempt a torpedo run, miss, take return fire, withdraw, or burn. PT-48's twin 50 caliber Brownings could fire 850 rounds per minute, devastating against wooden boats, but completely useless against armored barges, as the rounds sparked off steel and did nothing. Every night, the Japanese ran supplies down the slot in operations Americans called the Tokyo Express, first with destroyers, then with barges once air attacks made destroyer runs too dangerous, slower, smaller targets that were harder to detect and immune to PT boat torpedoes. Desperate for solutions, some crews mounted single-shot Army 37mm anti-tank guns on their bows, including PT-109 under Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, but one round, followed by manual reloading under machine gun fire, wasn't sustainable when the Japanese were running 20 to 30 barges per night, each capable of carrying 60 soldiers or 8 tons of supplies. 3 miles inland sat Henderson Field, captured by U.S. Marines in August and by October reduced to a graveyard of wrecked aircraft, burned fuselages, and shattered fighters, including dozens of Bell P-39 Airacobras, strange aircraft with engines mounted behind the pilot and propeller shafts running under the cockpit, a design that left room in the nose for something remarkable: a 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon firing 150 rounds per minute, designed to destroy aircraft and light armor. Most of the P-39s at Henderson were total losses, engines seized and wings torn off, but the cannons were intact, untouched, because no one had a use for aircraft weapons on wooden torpedo boats. At dawn on October 20th, Lynch walked the field and counted 23 wrecked Airacobras, looked at the cannons protruding from shattered noses, then looked back toward the water where PT-48 waited and did the math. That afternoon, he asked his squadron commander a simple question with no paperwork and no approval process, and by 4:30, 4 PT boat crews were walking Henderson Field with cutting torches and wrenches, racing daylight to strip cannons from the dead aircraft. Aircraft armorer James Cuggan knew every bolt and hydraulic line in the P-39's cannon system, crawling into wrecked fuselages to free the guns, discovering cracked recoil cylinders, bent feed mechanisms, and finally one perfect assembly weighing nearly 280 pounds with recoil system and feed attached. Henderson Field's machine shop had 1 lathe, 1 drill press, and a welder running on rationed diesel fuel, and in less than an hour, a crude pedestal mount was sketched with a grease pencil, welded from scrap steel salvaged from destroyed landing gear, ugly, scorched, slightly unstable, but able to rotate and strong enough to hold a cannon never meant to be fired from a wooden deck. By 9 p.m., the mount was finished. By 10:30, the cannon was loaded onto a truck, ferried across the water, and bolted to the bow of PT-48 on a deck never designed for such recoil. And as Lynch stood on the bridge that night, staring at the dark sea ahead, he knew the next sound would decide everything, either the end of the Japanese barge runs or the moment the cannon tore straight through his own boat, and the answer would come in the darkness before dawn. Installing the base plate meant drilling 4 holes through 3/4-inch plywood and 2 inches of solid oak framing using nothing but a hand-crank drill, and each hole took 30 exhausting minutes to cut, 2 full hours of sweat and metal shavings in the dark, before by 01:15 on October 21st, the base plate was finally bolted down, and the crew lifted the cannon onto the mount. The collar fit, the yoke held, the gun elevated and depressed, and it rotated, not smoothly, but enough to fight. Ammunition was a problem no one had solved, because the Oldsmobile M4 used horseshoe-shaped magazines holding 30 rounds, each weighing 40 pounds when loaded, normally stored in the P-39's ammunition bay behind the cockpit, a space PT-48 did not have, so they stacked 6 loaded magazines on the deck beside the gun, planning to hand-feed them under fire. Crude, but functional, maybe. At 2 o'clock on October 21, 1942, PT-48 became the first United States Navy patrol torpedo boat ever armed with an aircraft automatic cannon. 9 hours from salvage to installation. No test firing, no stress testing, no training. None of that mattered because Japanese barges were running supplies that night. PT-48 departed Tulagi at 2200 hours alongside PT-40, PT-46, and PT-60 in standard formation, 2 boats north of Savo Island and 2 off Cape Esperance, and Lieutenant Robert Lynch commanded PT-48 with an untested 37mm cannon bolted to his bow, while gunner's mate second class Harold Mitchell volunteered to fire it. A man who had fought 12 patrols behind 50 caliber Brownings, but never fired an aircraft cannon, receiving only dockside instructions: point, press trigger, change magazines when empty. The hydraulic recoil will absorb most of the shock, probably. The night was overcast with no moon, visibility 200 yards in starlight, sea calm. PT-48 cruising on 2 engines at 15 knots to reduce noise, while Mitchell sat behind the cannon on an ammunition box with 6 loaded magazines stacked within reach. At 23:55 hours, the radar operator called out surface contacts bearing 320 at 4,000 yards, 4 contacts moving 8 knots, consistent with Daihatsu barges. And Lynch altered course to intercept, abandoning torpedo doctrine that demanded closing to 1,000 yards for weapons that could not hit these targets, knowing he had to get close enough for the cannon to matter. At 3,000 yards, he could see them silhouetted against darker water, 4 Type A Daihatsu barges in line, 49 feet long, 14-foot beam, single diesel engine, each mounting a Type 92 heavy machine gun and carrying troops, men visible sitting on deck. And as PT-48 closed to 1,500 yards, Mitchell charged the cannon by hand, felt the mechanism cycle, seated the first round, flipped the safety off, and waited. At 800 yards, the lead barge detected them, and the Type 92 opened fire, 7.7mm tracers stitching orange lines across the black water, 30 yards short, and Lynch held course because there was no turning back now. At 800 yards, Mitchell squeezed the trigger and the night exploded as the 37mm cannon roared, muzzle flash turning the bow white, recoil slamming the gun backward, the deck flexing under his feet while the mount held, and Mitchell kept firing as the M4 cycled at 150 rounds per minute, 2.5 rounds per second, emptying the 30-round magazine in 12 seconds as high-explosive shells smashed into the lead barge at the waterline. the first three punching through steel like cardboard, the fourth detonating inside the troop compartment, igniting diesel fuel as flames erupted and men leapt into the water, the barge burning forward another 50 yards before settling by the bow. Mitchell ripped the empty magazine free, slammed in the second, 8 seconds of eternity under fire, and the second barge tried to break away hard to port as Lynch closed to 600 yards, and Mitchell fired again, 30 rounds in 12 seconds, 22 hits, the sixth penetrating, the seventh touching off something catastrophic. As the barge didn't burn, it exploded, ammunition cooking off in a blast visible for miles as the hull disintegrated. The remaining barges scattered, one north toward Savo, one south toward Guadalcanal, and PT-48 pursued the southern target as Mitchell loaded his third magazine, now fighting the gun itself as the rotating collar bound from heat expansion, forcing him to muscle the cannon by hand, the bearing surfaces already wearing under combat stress. And at 700 yards he fired again as the barge returned fire, machine gun rounds punching through PT-48's plywood bow, one round passing 18 inches from Mitchell's position, but he never stopped firing as the 37mm shells walked from stern to bow, killing the engine, stopping the barge dead, men abandoning ship into the water, and though it didn't sink,
it was finished, and at 2:20, PT-48 broke contact. The Japanese supply run shattered in less than 5 minutes by a weapon never meant to be there. Mitchell had fired 90 rounds from the 37mm cannon, 3 full magazines, and the gun never jammed, the mount never failed, and the deck never collapsed. 2 Japanese barges were destroyed, 1 was disabled, and PT-48 took 0 casualties. Lynch radioed Commander Calvert at Tulagi with a brief transmission that carried enormous weight. The salvaged aircraft cannon worked, and it worked better than anyone had expected. By 0300, every PT boat commander in Squadron 3 was demanding an M4 cannon for his boat. But Henderson Field only had 23 wrecked Airacobras, and Squadron 3 had 12 operational PT boats, meaning the math didn't work. By October 23rd, 3 more boats, PT-40, PT-46, and PT-60, had cannons mounted on their bows as crews stripped 5 additional wrecked Airacobras at Henderson Field, turning salvage into a system where teams learned which bolts came first, which hydraulic lines to disconnect, and which electrical connectors to cut, dropping removal time from 90 minutes to 70, then to 55, as the pedestal mounts improved with each installation. Chief Fry refined the design after inspecting PT-48's mount and finding heavy wear on the rotating collar, adding bronze bushings salvaged from damaged aircraft wheel assemblies to reduce friction, so the second-generation mounts rotated smoothly even under combat recoil. Ammunition quickly became the bottleneck because Henderson Field's armory held only aircraft-style horseshoe magazines, each loaded by hand with 30 rounds, a process that took 8 minutes per magazine, even when rushed, while PT boat actions against barges could last 20 minutes or more, forcing armorers into 12-hour shifts that produced about 40 magazines per day, barely enough to keep 4 boats running 2 patrols per night. The high-explosive rounds proved devastating, designed to shred light aircraft structures, but even more lethal against the quarter-inch steel armor of Japanese barges, with each penetrating hit blowing a 12-inch hole and spraying lethal fragments inside, 2 or 3 hits disabling a barge, and 5 to 8 sinking it outright. On October 24th, PT-40 engaged 3 barges off Kimbay Bay and destroyed 2 of them with a single magazine, 30 rounds fired in 20 seconds, both barges burning and sinking within 2 minutes, while the third escaped damaged into darkness. Squadron 3 quickly realized the cannon had fundamentally changed PT boat tactics, replacing long-range torpedo attacks at 800 to 1,000 yards with direct fire engagements at 400 yards, increasing risk from return fire, but eliminating the problem of torpedoes running harmlessly beneath shallow draft targets. Japanese commanders noticed immediately, with radio intercepts on October 25th describing PT boats armed with heavy cannon and explosive shells, one message referring to them as demon boats with aircraft guns, marking a sharp psychological shift as barge crews who had operated with near impunity were now being destroyed before they could deliver supplies. By November 1st, 8 PT boats in Squadron 3 were operating with salvaged 37mm cannons. Henderson Field stripped of every usable M4 from wrecked P-39s, 21 cannons removed in total, with 17 mounted on boats and 4 held as spares, though maintenance quickly became a challenge as weapons designed for aircraft service suffered corrosion from salt water, seal degradation from tropical heat, and feed damage from coral dust, forcing gunners' mates to learn field maintenance with improvised tools. Technical Sergeant James Coogan transferred from Henderson Field to Tulagi in early November to support cannon upkeep, setting up a small workshop in a corrugated metal shed near the PT docks and training crews in full disassembly and repair over 3-day courses until every cannon-equipped boat had at least one qualified maintainer. The results reached higher command fast, with Squadron 3's after-action reports showing 8 patrols, 23 barges engaged, 14 destroyed, 6 damaged, 3 escaped, and 0 PT boats lost. And on November 18th, the commander of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron South Pacific sent a confidential dispatch to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, detailing the field modification, its combat success, and formally requesting official approval and procurement of aircraft cannons for PT boat service. A request born not from theory or doctrine, but from one untested weapon fired into the darkness off Guadalcanal that rewrote the fight.
The request sent to Washington included everything needed for institutional adoption: technical drawings of the pedestal mount, ammunition consumption tables, maintenance data, combat results, and Bureau of Ordnance received it on November 23rd, knowing that under normal circumstances the process would take months of design reviews, safety analysis, procurement planning, and production scheduling. But the numbers from Guadalcanal were impossible to ignore because PT boats armed with 37mm cannons were destroying Japanese barges at unprecedented rates, and the field modification simply worked. On December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, Bureau of Ordnance authorized production of standardized pedestal mounts for M4 cannons on PT boats, contracting a manufacturer in Rhode Island for an initial run of 100 units with a 90-day delivery timeline. But the South Pacific did not have 90 days. In mid-December, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 6 arrived at Tulagi with 12 fresh boats armed only with standard twin 50-caliber turrets and 20mm Olercons, expecting to fight with torpedoes, only to find Squadron 3 obliterating barges with salvaged aircraft cannons, and Squadron 6's commander immediately demanded the same capability, running into the same hard limit because Henderson Field had no more wrecked P-39s to strip, and every flyable Airacobra was needed by the 13th Air Force. The solution came from New Caledonia, where a cargo ship arrived carrying replacement parts for damaged P-39 fighters, including 12 brand-new M4 cannon assemblies still sealed in cosmoline, officially destined for aircraft maintenance, but unofficially redirected, signed out on paper for Henderson Field and never arriving there, instead flown directly to Tulagi aboard a Catalina flying boat. And by December 20th, Squadron 6 was installing factory-new cannons using refined pedestal mounts without cutting torches or improvised fittings. The difference was immediate, as salvaged cannons showed wear from crashes and combat, while the new weapons cycled smoothly with pristine hydraulics and perfect feed mechanisms.
and by January 1943, 24 PT boats operating in the Solomons carried 37mm cannons, spreading barge-busting capability across the entire force. Combat reports from January confirmed the impact, with 37 patrols engaging Japanese barges, 41 destroyed, 19 damaged, 8 escaping, while PT boat losses dropped sharply from 6 boats lost between September and November to only 2 between December and February, neither loss tied to barge engagements, proving the cannon did more than kill targets, it kept crews alive. Tactics evolved quickly as PT boats learned to attack in pairs, one closing to 400 yards to engage with the cannon, while the second provided suppressive fire with 50 caliber machine guns and stood ready for torpedo shots if larger ships appeared, maximizing firepower while minimizing exposure. Ammunition use became predictable, as most engagements required 2 to 3 magazines, 60 to 90 rounds, with complete destruction of a Daihatsu barge requiring 40 to 50 hits, depending on where the shells landed, fuel tanks, engines, or troop compartments, and crews learned to aim deliberately for maximum effect. The Japanese adapted by escorting barges with destroyers that engaged PT boats at long range with 5-inch guns, while barges scattered, a threat the 37mm cannon could not counter, devastating against barges but ineffective against destroyer armor, prompting requests for heavier weapons like 40mm Bofors or 3-inch deck guns, ideas abandoned because the weight required major hull modifications and stateside shipyard work that frontline units could not afford. Instead, Bureau of Ordnance developed a new armor-piercing 37mm round with a tungsten carbide penetrator capable of defeating light armor at close range, not enough for destroyers, but effective against patrol boats and sub-chasers, and limited quantities reached Tulagi in February 1943, 60 rounds per boat reserved for emergencies. Meanwhile, standardized mounts rolled out from Rhode Island, the first 50 completed in February and shipped west in March, arriving to find crews in the Solomons had already fabricated and installed over 30 field-expedient mounts that, while crude, accomplished the same mission as the factory versions. In March 1943, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 8 deployed to New Guinea, where Japanese forces relied heavily on barges in narrow coastal waters, and this time PT boats arrived already equipped with factory mounts, new M4 cannons, and adequate ammunition, the Guadalcanal field modification now official doctrine. Squadron 8 destroyed over 60 Japanese barges in its first 3 months, proving the cannon's effectiveness across different terrain and conditions. And by June 1943, Bureau of Ordnance authorized development of a purpose-built naval weapon, the 37mm M9 cannon, with a longer barrel, higher muzzle velocity, and heavier construction for sustained fire. No longer an aircraft gun adapted for war at sea, but a weapon born directly from one improvised decision made in the darkness off Guadalcanal that permanently changed how PT boats fought. The M9 cannon entered production in August 1943, manufactured by Colt's Patent Firearms Company in Hartford, Connecticut, and it was a completely different beast, weighing 405 pounds, nearly twice the mass of the salvaged M4, with a 78-inch barrel that pushed muzzle velocity to 3,000 feet per second, 50% faster than before, giving PT boats flatter trajectories, better penetration, and a decisive range advantage. The first M9s reached the Pacific in October 1943, where Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 15 received 24 cannons for installation, a process that required reinforced deck structures because the extra weight and recoil demanded steel backing plates beneath the plywood deck, adding 200 pounds of structural reinforcement per boat, a price commanders were more than willing to pay. Testing immediately confirmed the advantage, as effective range jumped to 1,000 yards compared to 600 for the M4, allowing PT boats to engage barges well before entering effective enemy fire, reducing American casualties while increasing kill rates. Ammunition use became predictable, as most engagements required 2 to 3 magazines, 60 to 90 rounds, with complete destruction of a Daihatsu barge requiring 40 to 50 hits, depending on where the shells landed, fuel tanks, engines, or troop compartments, and crews learned to aim deliberately for maximum effect. The Japanese adapted by escorting barges with destroyers that engaged PT boats at long range with 5-inch guns, while barges scattered, a threat the 37mm cannon could not counter. Devastating against barges, but ineffective against destroyer armor, prompting requests for heavier weapons like 40mm Bofors or 3-inch deck guns, ideas abandoned because the weight required major hull modifications and stateside shipyard work that frontline units could not afford. Instead, Bureau of Ordnance developed a new armor-piercing 37mm round with a tungsten carbide penetrator capable of defeating light armor at close range. Not enough for destroyers, but effective against patrol boats and sub-chasers, and limited quantities reached Tulagi in February 1943, 60 rounds per boat reserved for emergencies. Meanwhile, standardized mounts rolled out from Rhode Island, the first 50 completed in February and shipped west in March, arriving to find crews in the Solomons had already fabricated and installed over 30 field-expedient mounts that, while crude, accomplished the same mission as the factory versions. In March 1943, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 8 deployed to New Guinea, where Japanese forces relied heavily on barges in narrow coastal waters, and this time PT boats arrived already equipped with factory mounts, new M4 cannons, and adequate ammunition, the Guadalcanal field modification now official doctrine. Squadron 8 destroyed over 60 Japanese barges in its first 3 months, proving the cannon's effectiveness across different terrain and conditions. And by June 1943, Bureau of Ordnance authorized development of a purpose-built naval weapon, the 37mm M9 cannon, with a longer barrel, higher muzzle velocity, and heavier construction for sustained fire. No longer an aircraft gun adapted for war at sea, but a weapon born directly from one improvised decision made in the darkness off Guadalcanal that permanently changed how PT boats fought. The M9 cannon entered production in August 1943, manufactured by Colt's Patent Firearms Company in Hartford, Connecticut, and it was a completely different beast, weighing 405 pounds, nearly twice the mass of the salvaged M4, with a 78-inch barrel that pushed muzzle velocity to 3,000 feet per second, 50% faster than before, giving PT boats flatter trajectories, better penetration, and a decisive range advantage. The first M9s reached the Pacific in October 1943, where Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 15 received 24 cannons for installation, a process that required reinforced deck structures because the extra weight and recoil demanded steel backing plates beneath the plywood deck, adding 200 pounds of structural reinforcement per boat, a price commanders were more than willing to pay. Testing immediately confirmed the advantage, as effective range jumped to 1,000 yards compared to 600 for the M4, allowing PT boats to engage barges well before and
entering effective enemy fire, reducing American casualties while increasing kill rates. The M9 retained the same 30-round horseshoe magazine, but higher chamber pressures introduced a new problem: precision, because inconsistent seating depth could cause feed failures, forcing Armory personnel to develop strict loading procedures where every round was inspected and every magazine function tested before issue, slowing preparation but eliminating combat malfunctions. By January 1944, the 37mm cannon became standard factory equipment on PT boats, with Elko Naval Division installing M9s during construction at Bayonne, New Jersey, and Higgins Industries doing the same in New Orleans, meaning new boats rolled off production lines already armed, structurally reinforced, and fully integrated, completing a transformation that had taken just 18 months, from October 1942 to January 1944, from a salvaged aircraft weapon improvised in a jungle airfield to official naval doctrine. The success rippled outward as squadron commanders in the Mediterranean requested the same cannons in early 1944, facing similar problems against German F-lighters and Italian MAS boats whose shallow draft rendered American torpedoes ineffective, and Squadrons 22 and 29 received M9s in March, deploying into a very different environment of narrow seas, dense defenses, and heavy coastal artillery, where the cannon proved just as lethal. Throughout spring and summer 1944, Mediterranean PT boats shattered German coastal traffic, including an engagement off Anzio in April, where PT-208 fought 4 German lighters attempting to evacuate troops from the beachhead, destroying 2 and damaging a third in a 15-minute fight using just 120 rounds. When PT boats returned to the Philippines in October 1944, they entered waters where the war had begun for them nearly 3 years earlier, now facing Japanese forces desperately moving reinforcements by barges, freighters, fishing boats, anything that could float, and PT boats armed with 37mm cannons methodically annihilated this traffic. November statistics from Leyte operations tell the story. 36 PT boats on patrol, 87 Japanese vessels engaged, 63 destroyed, 19 damaged, only 5 escaping, achieved with minimal losses, 2 boats damaged by coastal artillery, and none lost to surface action. By late 1944, PT boats no longer resembled torpedo craft at all, carrying standardized weapons loads of 1 M9 37mm cannon forward, 40mm guns aft, multiple 50-caliber machine guns, and rocket launchers, transformed into heavily armed gunboats, a transformation that began 2 years earlier with a single salvaged aircraft cannon bolted onto PT-48 in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, proving that sometimes the most important weapons in war are not designed in factories, but discovered by desperate men who refuse to fight with what does not work. Colt manufactured more than 1,500 M9 37mm cannons between August 1943 and August 1945, and while not all went to PT boats, some equipping landing craft, patrol vessels, and coastal defenses, PT boats received priority because combat results left no debate. The boats needed the weapons, and the weapons worked. By early 1945, Japanese barge traffic in the Philippines had effectively ceased, not because Japan stopped attempting resupply, but because PT boats were destroying barges faster than they could be replaced, creating a tactical environment where shallow draft supply vessels simply could not survive, forcing Japanese commanders to rely on submarines and night airdrops, methods far more expensive and far less efficient, but safer than surface movement under cannon fire. The final major PT boat operations took place in Borneo in June 1945 during the invasion of Brunei Bay, where Australian and American forces encountered lighter resistance than expected, few barges to engage, and PT boats standing ready with weapons that had begun as desperate improvisation and ended as standard naval armament. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, ending a war in which 531 PT boats had served, 99 were lost to enemy action, accidents, or weather, and 432 survived, nearly all of them armed with 37mm cannons that had become defining equipment. Post-war analysis by the Navy's Bureau of Ships examined PT boat effectiveness across all theaters from 1942 through 1945, thousands of patrols and hundreds of engagements, revealing a clear and undeniable pattern, as boats without cannons from October 1942 through September 1943 destroyed an average of 0.3 enemy vessels per patrol, while boats operating with cannons from October 1943 through August 1945 destroyed an average of 1.8 vessels per patrol, 6 times more effective, with American casualties showing the same trend. During the Solomon Islands campaign from August through September 1942, PT boat crews lost an average of 4.2 sailors per week,
while from October 1942 through February 1943, after cannon installation, losses dropped to 1.7 sailors per week, a 60% reduction, because the cannon allowed engagements at ranges where Japanese return fire was far less effective. In total, PT boats armed with 37mm cannons destroyed more than 800 confirmed Japanese vessels, mostly Daihatsu-class barges, each capable of carrying 60 troops or 8 tons of supplies, meaning 48,000 troops never reached the battlefield, or 6,000 tons of food and ammunition never arrived. Japanese commanders acknowledged this impact after the war, including Vice Admiral Teiichi Kurita, whose staff records showed that from November 1944 through January 1945, Japanese forces in Leyte lost 73% of barge convoys to PT boat attacks, crippling defensive operations as frontline units received barely 30% of planned supplies, while the rest burned at sea under 37mm fire. The innovation spread beyond PT boats during the war, as landing craft mounted 37mm cannons for fire support, LCI gunboats carried multiple M9s, and LCS support craft used them for surface and anti-aircraft fire, all tracing back to weapons salvaged from wrecked fighters at Henderson Field. Lieutenant Robert Lynch survived the war, commanded PT-48 through 15 months of combat and 47 confirmed kills, received the Navy Cross in November 1942 with a citation that specifically referenced the innovation of mounting aircraft cannons on PT boats, then returned quietly to civilian life in Philadelphia as an electrical engineer, never publicly speaking about the modification before his death in 1978. Technical Sergeant James Coogan spent the rest of the war maintaining PT boat cannons at Tulagi, training more than 200 gunner's mates on M4 and M9 maintenance, later retiring from the Air Force as a master sergeant in 1962, leaving behind meticulous maintenance logs that survive today in the National Archives, documenting every salvaged cannon, every repair, and every malfunction. Chief Machinist Mate Donald Frey, who sketched the original pedestal mount with a grease pencil in Henderson Field's machine shop, received no medal or official recognition during the war, remained at Henderson until late 1943, transferred to Pearl Harbor for submarine maintenance duty, then returned to Tacoma after the war to work in a shipyard until his death in 1991. Gunner's Mate Second Class Harold Mitchell, who fired the first 37mm cannon from a PT boat on October 21, 1942, survived 42 more patrols, later transferring to PT 109 as a gunnery instructor, where he trained crews to use the salvaged cannons effectively. And together, these men proved that some of the most decisive weapons of the Second World War were not born in factories, but built in desperation, tested in darkness, and validated by results.
Mitchell received a Bronze Star for his actions at Vella La Vella in August 1943, survived the war, later worked for Boeing in Seattle, and died in 2006, while the very last M9 cannon ever produced left Colt's factory in Hartford on August 10, 1945, just 5 days before Japan surrendered, a weapon that never saw combat, assigned instead to PT-809, stationed at Samar in the Philippines, before the boat was decommissioned that October, and the cannon placed into storage at Subic Bay, its final disposition unknown. Of the 531 PT boats that served during World War II, only 12 survive today, 8 preserved as museum vessels and 4 in private ownership, and most of those survivors still retain their 37mm cannon mounts, some even with operational M9 cannons, including PT-617 at Battleship Cove in Fall River, Massachusetts, which displays a fully functional M9 mounted on the factory standard pedestal design that traces directly back to Donald Frey's improvised mount sketched in grease pencil at Henderson Field. The development path of the 37mm cannon was unlike almost any other naval weapon because it ignored the standard process entirely. No formal requirements, no design specifications, no prototypes, no controlled testing, no planned deployment.
instead beginning with desperate crews cutting guns out of crashed aircraft, welding crude mounts from scrap steel, and testing the idea in live combat, proving its worth with results before the bureaucracy ever became involved. From first combat use in October 1942 to factory installation in January 1944, the transformation took just 18 months, remarkably fast by bureaucratic standards and painfully slow by combat standards, because PT boat crews needed the weapon immediately and built it themselves long before official approval arrived. The innovation succeeded because it solved a real tactical problem using available resources. Japanese barges carried troops and supplies, American torpedoes could not hit them, and wrecked aircraft at Henderson Field provided the answer for crews willing to connect need with opportunity. Military organizations usually resist field modifications because unauthorized equipment creates maintenance problems, complicates logistics, raises safety risks, and increases liability. And Commander Alan Calvert knew that authorizing the first cannon installation without higher approval put his career at risk, because if the mount had failed and killed sailors or damaged PT-48's hull, he would have faced court-martial. Yet he approved it anyway because his boats needed to survive. The results justified that decision, and the Bureau of Ordnance deserves credit for responding correctly, because when the November 1942 dispatch arrived detailing the modification, they could have rejected it outright as unauthorized and unsafe, but instead they evaluated the data, 14 barges destroyed in 8 patrols, 0 PT boats lost, and approved production. The contrast with other services is striking, as the Army rejected countless battlefield modifications during the war for violating doctrine, from welded tank armor to altered infantry weapons, while the Navy, especially in the Pacific, proved more flexible, often adopting modifications that worked in combat. The 37mm cannon became the most successful field-modified weapon adopted by the U.S. Navy in World War II, surpassing other innovations like rockets, radar, and radios in direct combat impact, spreading across multiple theaters and transforming PT boats from fragile torpedo platforms into lethal gunboats. The lesson extended beyond the weapon itself, showing that innovation in war requires commanders willing to take risk, crews willing to experiment, and institutions willing to value results over doctrine, a pattern that still defines modern military innovation today. Lieutenant Lynch documented his results. Commander Calvert supported the risk. The Bureau of Ordnance evaluated the data, and the system worked. Even though none of the sailors who bolted that first cannon onto PT-48 in October 1942 could have imagined it would become standard naval armament. They were simply solving an immediate problem, and the numbers proved the solution. More than 800 Japanese vessels destroyed by PT boats armed with 37mm cannons, most of them Daihatsu barges that never delivered troops or supplies. PT boats earned their reputation not through advanced technology, but through ingenuity, wooden hulls, gasoline engines, simple weapons, and crews willing to adapt, improvise, and fight with whatever worked, a spirit that defined their operations and earned them names like Devil Boats and Green Dragons from Japanese commanders who learned to fear them. The 37mm cannon amplified everything PT boats already did well, matching firepower to mobility and turning night patrols into supply line killers. And the full story takes time to tell, because innovation is never simple. It involves people, risk, failure, persistence, and results. If this story mattered to you, hit the like button, because every like helps these forgotten histories reach new audiences. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we rescue real stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about sailors and mechanics who saved lives by turning crashed fighters into naval weapons. And before you go, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else entirely, because this community spans the world, and by being here, you're helping make sure that Lynch, Mitchell, Frey, and Coogan do not disappear into silence. Men who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are not designed but discovered.